disease called AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, sounds less than deadly, more like a diet pill. AIDS has struck only a reported 1,500 people, but it has killed almost 600 of them, and as yet no one with AIDS has been cured.
Puzzling new disease has appeared in the past couple of years that is spreading rapidly among homosexuals, and it is a disease that is fatal.
You are raising the possibility that people are dismissing it because it strikes mostly the gay community?
There is no question in my mind. If this were happening to you in the white, straight, middle-class community, it would have been attended to a long
The 1980s AIDS epidemic first began as a homosexual disease, commonly dubbed the gay plague. But as time wore on, the number of diagnoses grew at rapid rates, sparking a nationwide epidemic. Now known as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS began as a form of pneumonia recognized in many homosexuals and injecting drug users. Research supported that the disease was sexually transmitted. This opposed previous theories that it was contracted through air or touch. By 1993, over 1,000 Americans had been diagnosed with AIDS and 394 had died. These deaths had caught the attention of both the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, and the American Red Cross. The two engaged in debate over the most effective method to prevent the spread of AIDS. The Red Cross ignored the CDC's previous requests to screen blood donors because of the high expense and the fear that it would discourage future donors. The CDC, however, believed screening was necessary in order to avoid the risk of infection and issued a list naming 4 groups determined to be the highest risk groups of donors. Those among the list were advised not to give blood. Homosexual men in particular were isolated on this list. The CDC had yet to recognize that AIDS diagnoses had expanded beyond the homosexual community, and isolating them would do little to prevent possible infection. The San Francisco Coordinating Committee of Gay and Lesbian Services stated that donor screening was reminiscent of miscegenation blood laws that divided black blood from white and similar in concept to the World War II rounding up of Japanese Americans in the western half of the country to minimize the possibility of espionage. Homosexuals felt greatly discriminated and indecent as their blood was stereotyped as impure compared to heterosexuals. They greatly fought against donor screening on the basis of invasion of privacy in order to avoid being isolated from the rest of their country. While the debate raged on, the nation saw women and children become infected with AIDS. The epidemic had grown with little research and support given, especially from the federal government. The group of recently diagnosed citizens reinforced the CDC's fear that the AIDS epidemic was growing out of control. Citizens had previously failed to realize that anyone is susceptible to AIDS, and irrational fears now began to arise. The irrational fears were dealt with in many different ways. Jokes about those with AIDS made light of the situation by making fun of condom usage and safe sex. Movies and television also unintentionally glorified the consequences of multiple sexual partners. The lack of knowledge led to misconceptions that the disease is spread through air or touch and ultimately led to mass hysteria. Fortunately, the AIDS epidemic saw the creation of multiple grassroots organizations that helped to influence fundraising and gather information for the new disease, thus putting an end to the nation's excuse for ignoring it. ACT UP, or AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was formed. ACT UP seized media attention with demonstrations and street theater. Despite having a radical image, the goal of ACT UP was to bring attention to the AIDS crisis and influence the increase of research funds. The gay community also collectively organized the Names Project by placing the names of AIDS victims on panels, which were then sewn into quilts and hung across the country as a visual representation of the amount of lives taken by AIDS. The Gay Men's Health Crisis was the largest political advocacy and community-based AIDS organization in the United States. The group donated large sums of money to AIDS research and other media projects. Their media projects were aimed at those who had no connection to victims of AIDS. Their goal was to spread the awareness of the disease and gather support from both the families of victims and those still unaffected. However, despite the passion of the gay community to gain funding for the epidemic, the presidential administration, which was the most powerful tool needed to help those suffering with AIDS, lacked involvement and did little to influence research. The point that drove home the reality of the AIDS epidemic came when some of the nation's most notable figures contracted the disease. Magic Johnson, a basketball player for the LA Lakers, failed to use a condom and contracted AIDS.
I'm young, I still have good health, so I'm going to take advantage of it. It's just all one big party, one big show, big fun. That's all it is, just big fun.
After Johnson announced that he was HIV positive, his story greatly increased condom usage in men as fears began to surface that they too were susceptible to the disease. Although not famous, Ryan White became a prominent symbol of courage for those suffering with AIDS. A school in White's hometown denied his admittance to the school based on the fears and complaints of other parents that their children would contract the disease as well. Ryan was later admitted back to school along the rules of having separate bathrooms and no physical education. He was readmitted because his mother brought her son's denial to court, and a public health official ruled that contact with Ryan did not endanger others. Ryan White passed away on April 8, 1990, at the age of 19 years old after a hard and long-fought battle with AIDS. Reverend Raymond Probasco stated of Ryan in his eulogy, "It was Ryan who first humanized the disease called AIDS. Ryan's struggle made the disease more personal to many families and stressed the urgency that everyone is at risk and must take precautions to avoid infection."
I think we felt like we weren't alone. And Ryan always said, for the first time, Mom, I feel like we're not fighting this disease alone, that we got other people fighting it with us. And I think for the first time, when he was first diagnosed, we saw such negativity. And to see so much positive with celebrities lending their face and voice to the AIDS epidemic, I think it made a big difference.
Many criticized President Reagan for wishing upon a magic wand to cure the disease, as he spoke in honor of Ryan after his death because they knew he could have progressed the research of AIDS further but failed to gather funds. Even as the 1980s came to a close, the epidemic, although far less severe, continues today. From the early 1980s until 1993, AIDS was the leading cause of death in people ranging from 25 to 44 years old. However, since the 1980s, there have been massive breakthroughs in treatment options for AIDS victims. Multi-drug treatments are now available that help to lengthen the lives of AIDS patients.
Ryan wasn't the only hemophiliac at the time who had been diagnosed with AIDS.
That's true. About 12,000 people contracted HIV through blood products. But the good news is since 2008 was the last time there's a known reported case of HIV transmission through the blood supply. And prior to that, we hadn't seen a case since 2002, so we've come a long way. The blood supply became safe in 1985, and now fewer than 100 people since Ryan's death have contracted HIV through the blood supply.
Researchers state, as AIDS has become entrenched in the U.S. and elsewhere, a new generation has grown up with little, if any, knowledge of those dark early days, but they are worth recalling as a cautionary tale about the effects of the bafflement and fear that can surround an unknown disease. Since the 1980s, we have learned to take all necessary precautions to prevent the epidemic from ever happening again.